Salam and welcome back to the TMV podcast brought to you by the Muslim Vibe. My name is Salim Kassam and once again I am your host. Wow, it's been over 2 years since I've actually done that. Honestly, it's amazing to be back and I'm really excited to host and produce these conversations. I think really important topics we've covered in the past and I want to cover again. With that, I'm going to jump straight in and introduce you. My guest this week is Hasanain Jaffer. He is a social justice educator and activist. He spent many years with Citizens UK in their Birmingham chapter and the national board. Formerly a board member of Sponsor Refugee, formerly a director of Basic Income UK. For many years, he's been studying and talking about racism, white supremacy, imperialism, and capitalism. So firstly, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
Introduction, happy with?
Yeah.
Does that cover the majority of it?
Yeah, it covers everything we need to cover, I think.
So I guess to kind of frame this conversation, when I was offered to restart the TMV podcast, we're in the middle of a very intense period, I think, in the Middle East. What we've been seeing on our TV screens and on social media, I think a lot more this time as well, has been, I think, very difficult for a lot of people. And I thought it would be important to try and have a conversation, not about the here and now and about what's happening today, yesterday and tomorrow, but rather more big picture. So we're talking about Palestine and the systems of oppression. So and it's something that when we spoke about this beforehand, you said that you have been kind of on this journey and you've been studying these like wider systems for many years. And when you've spoken about it in communities, it hasn't been well received or people haven't really understood or resonated with it.
Yeah.
And then now with what's happening, people are a lot more receptive and understanding. So I think to start off with, just your general thoughts and feelings over what's been happening in Palestine in the last few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this, not centering it just in the here and now, but talking about the systems in a wider context. And can I just say, it's really hard to do that right now. It's really hard. Whenever you're in the middle of something like what we're seeing happening in Palestine and the death and destruction that we're witnessing, it's really difficult to zoom out and view it in this almost cold and calculated way.
Yeah.
It's also really important. It's really important that we're able to recognize the patterns, that we're able to see why this is happening and, where it all comes from and make sure that we're part of the solution, both now and long term going forward. So yeah, that's why when I look at what's happening in Palestine, from the beginning, it's been clear to me, how the colonial exploitation that we've seen for centuries is happening again right now. That when we talk about systems of white supremacy, we can see how those systems have played out in multiple events over the years and, culminate in the kind of destruction that we're seeing today. So yeah, that's what I mean when I say we zoom out and we look at the global systems of oppression.
But you did an Instagram live a couple of days ago and you spoke very early on in the live about witnessing what's happening and one of our roles being witnessing what's actually taking place. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think the thing is what's happening now, this is a genocide. I think we have to be clear about that. Is not new, is what I was saying, in terms of it is not new as in genocides have happened before, and that even today, this isn't the only genocide that's happening today. What is different, I think, about the genocide that's happening today is that it is literally being live streamed to each and every one of our mobile phones. And I know that previously, atrocities like this have been on social media but when you put together all the different factors, the scale of the genocide, the rate at which people are dying right now, and the fact that every moment of it is being live streamed to our mobile phones, you get two things. One is you get real clarity that the most urgent thing that we need to be acting on, not just as Muslims, but in general as a human community right now, is stopping this genocide, right? But the other thing is that the fact that it's being sent to each and every one of us is a challenge. We're being asked to witness this. We are being asked, each and every one of us, what our role in this will be. What are we going to be doing about it? And that's what makes this especially important, that we respond in the right way to this.
I think for me personally, one of the things that I found really difficult is to actually watch the videos that are on social media. So often you'll get the cover on the front of it that will say, this contains graphic image, whatever. Personally, I'll often skip past because I find it incredibly difficult. Even sometimes I'll see just a couple of seconds of one of these clips, and it's incredibly difficult to bear. And at the same time, I also feel like I don't want to burden somebody else with that. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not a nice thing because on the one hand, I think from everything that we're seeing on social media, you feel like an urgent need to tell people what's happening, to report on the numbers, to show. And the thing is, there's so much footage. There's so many clips. And I think, people listening to this will have seen more images of dead children than anyone should ever see in their lifetimes. And that's in a few weeks period.
We've seen more clips of dead children than should be happening in this sort of circumstances. Like, it just, and yes, you're right. So, and there's a few different ways of thinking about this. On the one hand, for us, we're witnessing it, and we have the privilege of being able to turn our phones off and look in another direction. The other thing,
I guess, sorry, the question on my conscience sometimes is like, should I feel bad about doing that, about that luxury that I've got, or is it just a case of, actually, I don't want, I shouldn't have to. I know this stuff is happening. Do you know what I mean? It's a very difficult position.
It's a difficult question, and I don't think it's got the same answer for everybody. I think everybody has to think about where they are on this journey and figure out what would work best. But I would say the helpful thoughts to think about when you're witnessing all of this is, first of all, our mental health is important. The fact that we are actively responding to this, right? In having this conversation, or in general, we are actively responding to what is going on. That's the important thing. And sometimes by browsing these social media videos, by looking again and again, it can impact our ability to act. It can impact our ability to resist. And I think in that case, it does make sense to dial it down a bit. But what is also important to recognize is that the Palestinians are not exhibitionists in the way they're showing their dead to us, in the way they are displaying their suffering to us. Like, they're doing it because they are asking us to witness. And so the witnessing itself is important. And really, when we come down to brass tacks, why is the entire world right now, or what we're seeing is this galvanization, right, of society. Like, we're seeing an increased interest in what's happening and an increased resistance to what's happening. Why is it happening? It's happening because we were asked to witness, and we are witnessing, and we are responding. And so when we turn away, we have to recognize that we're choosing not to participate in that witnessing, and we have to be conscious about it. That's not to say don't ever do it. It's to say, when you do it, be conscious that what you're doing is stepping away, and also do step back in, because we're being asked to witness. I think that is important to keep in front of mind.
I think for me personally as well, one of the things I've been observing, because it was interesting, like I wasn't at the beginning of this particular conflict, I didn't have the TMB podcast, for example, to be able to talk about this stuff and bring people on and explore it and whatever. So I was like taking stock of everything that I'm seeing. Yeah. And one of the things that became apparent, and a friend kind of put it to me in this way, that there's almost this footballification of the conflict. So you have people waving different flags. You have people on the Palestine side, on the Israel side. Yeah. And I think Piers Morgan is a great example of like that battleground, so to speak, but like on a very superficial level. So he brought on Muhammad Hijab, and he had a rabbi there, and it's like, what's going to happen, the tit for tat, and it's just entertainment. Yeah. And Piers Morgan is loving all of the clicks and the engagement and the reach that he's getting. He's almost central to this particular conflict because he's garnered all of the attention of people. Yeah. Like his Bassem Youssef interview, for example, was, I think, his most watched, but probably one that I've not seen a clip shared as much as that long interview anywhere. But I feel like there's that element to it, and that's somewhat died down a little bit, although still people are very up for jumping on the bandwagon about talking about these issues and whatever else. But then, like I said, the conversation I wanted to have with you was about going a step deeper and talking about the wider issues here, because my concern and my worry is that the longer that this goes on, the more people become desensitized to it, because it's just happening every day. There are people dying. There are heartbreaking stories, but when one person dies, it's a tragedy. When a million die, it's a statistic, and we don't want to get to that level. So I think for me, it's about understanding what are the deeper root causes of something like this. We're not going to sit down today and resolve and create peace in the Middle East. People have been trying to do that for years. So from your perspective, based on the journey that you've been on and the things that you have studied and talk about to communities, things like you said about imperialism and capitalism and whatever else, I guess the first question I have for you is how do you frame, or how do you see the world today through that lens? You've got time, so take your time. It's not a small question.
It's a difficult question. How do I see the world with these systems in place? So I think I am a normal person, right? So I'm a parent, I have kids, I go to work, I have a business, I earn money, I like nice things like everyone else, I drive a car, etc. I operate in this world like anybody else does. I think that the difference I see is I'm trying, it's a journey, to be more conscious about the systems in which I'm participating. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is a difference between, and we can bring this back to Palestine Action in a minute, but there's a difference between going to work and asking your boss for a promotion, knowing full well that actually the bulk of what I'm asking for, I am owed because I am the laborer, and actually I have done the work around this. And there's a difference going to work and asking your boss for a promotion from the perspective of, oh, you're a manager, you must be better than me, please bestow me with some more money. Right? Now, that difference is one thing, it's consciousness. That's all it is. The difference is that one person is conscious of his value and his worth, his place in the system, is conscious of how flawed the system is, but will still go to work and will still ask his boss for a promotion. That is, I think, what I see as the main difference that I am trying to inspire, is this idea that what we need to do first is to become conscious of the world systems, how they operate, how they work, how they impact each and every one of us. So when Palestine happens and I look at what's going on in Palestine and think about how we act when it comes to Palestine, I wasn't massively surprised by the fact that the Labour Party sat on their backside during a vote in Parliament for a ceasefire, because I understand that the system was oriented towards colonialism, and this is a colonial exploit, right? What I do is, yes, I wrote to my MP. I'm sure most people wrote to their MPs, but I wrote to my MP knowing that I'm doing this only because I understand that this is the most efficient way to call for a ceasefire right now, or one of the efficient ways in which we can call for a ceasefire right now. I also understand that in this parliamentary democracy that we live in, power doesn't really sit to there. It only sits in Parliament because we allow it to sit in Parliament. Power resides within each one of us and within the collective. Like, these are big concepts that I'm just throwing out there, and you can ask me more about them. But when you ask how I see the world, I think it's participating with this recognition and consciousness that not everything is as it seems, and that the narratives we're being told are lies, and what we're being told is how the world has to operate, or is the best way for the world to operate, is essentially a lie. And the basis of that lie is the capitalist system, is the growth imperative, is the idea that we constantly have to grow capital. That is the basis of the entire world system.
It's interesting because this morning I just finished reading The Consequences of Capitalism by Noam Chomsky. It's a lecture series by Noam Chomsky. I can't remember the co-author, or the guy who gave the other set of lectures. I apologize if he's listening, probably not. But that was very eye-opening.
Yeah.
Because you start to look at the world, and he looks at historical events and everything through this kind of theoretical lens, which is something that I think we don't do often enough. And I know I've been guilty of that. So for the longest time, I'm dealing with the here and now. So I'm like, okay, this MP that I have, his track record is X, Y, Z. Therefore, he cares about this, and that. But that's just a very, very small piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
It's like when you zoom out, and there was something in the book that blew my mind. So America was founded in 1776. I'll let you get back to your thing, but there's just one thing I have to put out there. 1776, America was founded. Guess how many years of peace America has had since then?
50.
20 years. So that's 222 years out of 239. They've been in some form of conflict. 93% of America's existence, they have been in some form of conflict around the world. And again, then within the book, he talks about the capitalistic industries and the military and all of this stuff. And you just realize that we're not living in a normal world. So even, I can't remember the exact figure, but the military budget for the US is, I believe, 650 or 750 billion pounds a year. And that figure is if you add up the next 10 countries in the list, that figure is bigger than that. It's astonishing.
Mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. But, an empire has to spend lots of money on their military.
So anyways, I want you to go back in. I just needed to get that off my chest. Literally, that the military budget was this morning, and I didn't even, I had to put it out somewhere. So you were talking about capitalism.
Capitalism
underpinning
is a start, but then we get to, we get to more obvious forms. For this, what we're seeing now, what we're witnessing, I think one of the first things, so a few months ago, we had Ukraine happen, right? Or a couple of years ago now, right? We had Ukraine happen, and, as Muslims, I think we all had similar feelings around the Ukraine conflict. There was this sort of, oh, yeah, that's bad. And then there was like, oh, hang on. The world reaction is interesting. Because we, as young men, we've lived through the Iraq War, we've seen what's happened in Syria, we have had this constant battle to get anybody to even look at what's happening. We've had this constant, I was a board member at Sponsor Refugee. Sponsor Refugee was this organization where we were getting communities like churches, mosques, synagogues, different communities to commit to sponsor a family from Syria to come and live in the UK. It was actually really simple, right? They needed to find a house for them. I think it was £10,000 a year, the commitment. It was not a big ask. But we did a lot of work going out to these communities and trying and recruiting them. We got about 29 or 30 over a span of 2 years, and we were proud of the work we did. I mean, we were volunteers, and we were like, we got 29 or 30. And then Ukraine happened, and the doors opened. When I say the doors opened, households in the UK in their thousands are signing up to give their spare room over to a Ukrainian refugee. It was mind-blowing. I'm not wishing anything else for the Ukrainian refugees. Yes, we should give them houses. But where were you? Where was everyone when it came to Syria, when it came to Iraq, right? For me, that was a moment where white supremacy became the clarity I gained in that moment around white supremacy and the way in which people are viewed as different depending on the color of their skin, depending on what part of the world they're from.
Do you put it down specifically to white supremacy? Because, I mean, again, with that particular situation, Russia is seen as a bad guy. Throughout history, throughout cinema, the Russians have always been bad. Now, this is the enemy of the West. And they're bullying a smaller country, Ukraine. So it's in our strategic advantage and to our benefit to support Ukraine in that particular situation. Do you think, because Russia arguably white as well in that sense, right?
So I think this is a question I get all the time, is why do you call it white supremacy and not racism, for example, right? And I want to just take a step back and explain that for a minute, because it links into what we were talking about earlier, and it links into Palestine as well, right? Is that when I talk about white supremacy, I'm talking about a system that hasn't emerged. So, years ago, when we think about the times of the Prophet, when we think about what the Quran talks about, there was always this idea of discrimination. Discrimination is when one group of people discriminates against another group of people, right? The difference is that discrimination has always happened between groups of people on almost like an even playing field. I don't like you, you don't like me, okay, we stay apart, or we might fight sometimes or whatever. Racism and white supremacy was entirely different. It's a different system. It's only a few hundred years old. It was born as a result of this growth imperative of capitalism. So what happens is something like, for example, the British Empire. They are radically motivated to grow their wealth, to grow their capital. They look out and say, okay, we need to make this growth of capital more efficient. We need the land, the resources, the natural resources of countries other than our own. We need cheaper labor. How do we go and just get that? Which is what they did. That's colonialism, right? It's like, how do we go and just exploit? They needed two things to make sure that there was no revolt in their own lands for that. One was motivation, right? So people need to be motivated to believe whatever we tell them. How do you motivate people? Wealth, prosperity, good health. Capitalism brings that anyway. What else do we need? We need justification. The justification was not just manufactured through words. The justification was manufactured in a number of ways. One of the ways was the creation of racism. When I say creation, I mean that British universities, European universities, they had scientists doing experiments on skulls and talking about how black people have smaller brain sizes, or if your nose is a certain length, then it affects your emotional capability. I mean, these are just examples I'm throwing out there, but this actually happened. This is what we know is racial science. It affected, they talk about how they're psychologically stunted, or how they're emotionally stunted, or how they're intellectually stunted. All of this created this justification. Now, when we enslave black people, actually, they're fulfilling their rightful place in the world, right? So now, that's what racism was, a formal, scientifically justified system where you could put white people at the top and then by pigmentation create a hierarchy with black people at the bottom. So that's why we call it white supremacy, because that system had white people at the top and had everyone else underneath. And that system was formally abolished, right? So now there's no scientist in the world who would say that your nose length corresponds to your IQ. You know when it was formally abolished? It was formally abolished after the Holocaust. Because what happened with Hitler was that the idea of white supremacy took on a life of its own. It went beyond just the growth of capital.
Yeah.
And he started applying this racial science in a way that allowed him to discriminate against Jewish people to the extent that he wanted to exterminate Jewish people. And it led to the Holocaust.
So just correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just trying to piece together what you just said. And that's that these theories of white supremacy, or whatever racial science as you called it, were put in place as a means of benefiting financially from like a capitalistic sense. Is that what you're saying underpins all of this?
100%.
And sorry, just to extend that to talking about the Holocaust, then you're saying that the idea of white supremacy then essentially took a life of its own, and in its extreme form then became what we saw in Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and the Jewish community. Yeah.
I'll give you another example of when the system of white supremacy took a life of its own. Zionism. Zionism was a very small branch of Judaism, right? And it was almost a small fringe branch of Judaism. Like, most Jews had never heard of or accepted the ideas of Zionism prior to the Balfour Declaration, right, in 1930.
I'm not good with dates.
Yeah.
You're meant to be bringing the...
Yeah, I had it all in my... So, I mean, 1917 is when Theodor Herzl wrote this, handbook of Zionism, right? And he went to the British at that time. And do you know why he went to the British with it? Yes, Palestine was a British colony, but Palestine wasn't the only other option. They had considered other options, other lands where they might have a Jewish homeland.
I found out recently Uganda was on that list.
Well, there you go.
There were random countries.
Russia was on that list. There were random places on that list.
Yeah.
But they went to the British, and in his letter to, I don't know, one of the British lords, he wrote, "I come to you because you have experience with this. This is a colonial project." Like, that's what it was. That's what it is. So when we see what's happening in Palestine today, like, and you ask me about Hamas, like, this has nothing to do with any of that. This was and always is, it always has been a colonial project. Since 1948, since the first Nakba, what has happened in Palestine has been a colonial project. And then the same tools that justified colonialism back in the day, you know, this idea of racism and white supremacy, those are the same tools today that are being used as propaganda to allow the rest of the world to turn away from Palestine. So one of the major ones is the racial science enabled dehumanization of non-white people. And what we're seeing today, the reason why when there is an attack, when in terms of scale might be minuscule compared to what's going on, but if the victims are white, the world is enraged in an entirely different way. But when the victims are people of color, consciously or subconsciously, there is this feeling like, oh yeah, but you know.
So I work in the charity sector.
Yeah.
And I always find it incredible because we work in countries like Afghanistan, for example. And when there are literally atrocities that take place there targeting minority communities, where they're fundraising, we're dealing with literally the families, where our staff are in the hospitals and supporting those individuals.
Yeah.
But like, it doesn't, firstly, it's not on the news here. Like when we're trying to find information, it's very, very few places that will even report on it. And it always makes you think like, and again, this is something that Chomsky mentions in The Consequences of Capitalism, that, you know, in our newspapers, on our media generally, you always have to look at what's not being said.
Yeah.
And what he means by that is that there are 1,000,001 things that happen any given day.
Yeah.
Why have particular stories been chosen? Yeah. Why is this talked about? Why is this not talked about? It's a conscious decision or even a subconscious decision every time. And it comes back similarly to, like, you know, the example you mentioned about Syrian refugees versus Ukrainian refugees, where we saw, and even with the Iraq war and Afghanistan way back when, I saw firsthand the impact that it had on people that I know, on their families and their lives, because you're currently worried about people back home, but that isn't covered. No one's talking about that. No, exactly. There's always this massive disparity between certain people and others, and it's just fascinating. Yeah,
it is fascinating, and it's also different now. So the Ukrainian refugees, the Syrian refugees, the Iraq war, all of that, we witnessed that. I'm not even sure I had the language. You know, when the Ukrainian refugees thing happened, I had the language there. But definitely when the Syrian refugees thing was, I didn't really have the language to think, why is it so hard, you know? And then there was this, like, you know, white middle class movement towards supporting refugees, and we used to see these swings of, you know, they say in the UK 25% of people are always anti-refugee, 25% of people are always pro. And then there's this 50% in the middle. And depending on what the Daily Mail or the Guardian is reporting on, it just swings this way and that way, right? Not so when it comes to white refugees. Like, that whole dynamic changes completely. But Palestine is different. Palestine has changed the narrative because, I mean, it's hard to know exactly why, but partly it's because of the social media and how prevalent it's been on social media. Partly it's because of the Black Lives Matter movement and how that had already started awakening conscience around racism a little bit, largely in an unconscious way, but it started there. But somehow this has come at a time where it has become undeniable. Like, the conversations I have been having now where to say to someone that it's because they're not white has become almost a mainstream idea, has become almost like, because it's so undeniable.
Okay, but just on that point specifically, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I from my understanding, 76%, there was a poll done at some point, 76% of people in the UK want a ceasefire.
Yeah.
Okay. Yet still, those in power, although ironically we live in a democracy where those in power represent us, but those in power have voted against the ceasefire. I don't understand personally what's going on right now, because on the one hand, on social media, and even I think The Economist did a really interesting poll where it's like everyone, like young people essentially, are on the Palestine side of things, whereas older people over 60s are all pro-Israel and whatever. But there seems to be this huge disconnect between the people, the demos in democracy, and the system. But how, like, but nothing seems to be giving at the same time. Like, people are getting more and more, and I think that's the thing with this particular time. I've always said it's been so different. This, like, you know, I've been to Palestine protests like my entire, I think we've probably been to some when we were kids. I've been my whole life. But this particular moment in time that we're living through right now, there's something that's awakening in people that, you know, I would have never dreamed would turn up to a protest, post about it, care even.
Take direct action.
And almost like making me look bad, where I'm trying to go to Tesco's and they're like, no, you can't go to Tesco's, it's... I'm like, where is this coming from, right?
Yeah.
And it's amazing that people are so, I guess, captured by what's happening.
Yeah.
But I do think that we're missing something here.
I mean, the political example you give is a good one because it is exactly what we're talking about. What Palestine is doing, what's happening to us, this consciousness that we're talking about, it's a concept called critical consciousness. I know Chomsky has a different terminology for
common
it.
Sense. He
calls it common sense. Yeah, and I think liberation scholars in general talk about this consciousness as one of the first stages. Like, this needs to happen for society in general. This needs to happen to precipitate some sort of revolution. By revolution, I mean a dismantling of the current systems and a bringing about of new systems in the world, right? But the political one, I mean, is another reason why there's this awakening is happening right now, right? But part of the reason why Palestine is so different is because Israel is so bad at this. Like, they're like childish toddlers in the way they're going about this, right? There has been no tact, no sort of, at least America and Britain have this weird sort of dystopian maturity about the way in which they conduct their empires. Israel doesn't have that. And so now we're in this situation where they're indiscriminately bombing. Their soldiers are celebrating the death of people. They're talking about Hamas, but they're occupying the houses of people who have left Gaza. Like, there's this major disconnect, right? And then this disconnect flows everywhere. It's like peeling apart these layers, and in the peeling is where the consciousness is being awakened. And one of the things that is like peeling away is the illusion of democracy, right? Like, what is democracy? We have this idea that every 4 years or 5 years, we get to go and cast a vote. And because of this one vote that we get to cast, we have the power in this society. But it's nonsense, right? Because like you said, 76% of people want a ceasefire right now. And yet, we want a free Palestine. Forget that. We'll compromise. Let's just have a ceasefire for now. All we're asking for is stop bombing children. Like, very simple, very easy request. So much so that 76% of people can jump on board with that request, right? But the political class can still completely ignore it, to the extent that the Labour Party, 82% of Muslims voted for the Labour Party at the last election. 82% of Muslims. When we recognized that Labour was going to be in power at the next election, we were happy about that. When Joe Biden became the president of the United States of America, we were celebrating because it was the end of Trump. None of them can even go as far as calling for a ceasefire or any sort of restraint. No, in fact, we're getting the opposite, right? We're seeing like Keir Starmer go out there and justify the siege on Gaza, right? Like, where is the democracy gone? Am I going to vote for Labour or for the Tories at the next election? No, because they have both proved themselves not to be able to stand up to the biggest genocide happening right now. And
can I jump in?
Is there any chance
Go on.
that either of the parties, that any other party will be in power apart from those two? No. There is no chance. Yeah. So the democratic illusion, for me, my democracy is gone in the sense of having somebody in power.
So I'm glad that's where you went, because that's what I wanted to touch on. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, because I want to have that kind of broad conversation. But I think it's important. This is something I did want to address at some point, not with yourself, maybe with another guest, talking about this, the politics and the party politics and how we engage as Muslims. Like you said, 82% of Muslims voted for the Labour Party. And there was that Muslim census that came out very recently that basically said that the majority of Muslims said they would not vote.
5%. 5% now is the Labour Party support amongst Muslims.
According to that census, which had thousands of respondents. Now, I personally look at that, and what frustrated me is that they said they wouldn't vote at all. So they're disengaging from the political system. But I feel like... yes, we don't have a perfect political system here, but we have some ability to have a say as to who the elected leader is and who our representatives are and all of that stuff. Do you believe in disengaging entirely from the political system, so not voting? Muslims shouldn't, or no one should vote.
No.
Until we have the revolution that you spoke about earlier.
I think we have to. I think we should vote. I think we should engage politically. I think we should do it with a complete consciousness about what we're doing.
It comes back to that first thing you mentioned.
It comes back to the first
about
thing.
Understanding.
Like, there are two ways of looking at this, right? We want a ceasefire. I am going to write to my MP and I'm going to ask them, or I'm going to vote with this understanding that, I'm voting for you because I really like your policies and I want the Tories out and I want to hear what you have to say. And please, Mr. Powerful Man, give me what I think society needs. Or there is, I know that this system is imperfect, because actually a democratic system needs to have far more direct democracy than we have here, right? So I know this system doesn't work. However, I know that by voting for you, I might be mitigating some harm, for example. I also know that I am only voting for you for this reason, and actually I will be holding you accountable through the year. And I also know that the only reason this system stands is because of my and everybody else's participation in this system. So bringing it back to Palestine, the way to think about it is, when we act now for a ceasefire even, like, we can write to our MP and go and protest and try and convince them to vote for a ceasefire. It isn't working, right? Like, we're seeing it.
Yeah.
But rather than feel despair, we have to recognize that we have the power to uphold that system or to collapse it. The same with all these world systems of oppression. Collectively, it's only because we participate in the capital system, in the democratic system, in the system of white supremacy. We participate in these systems. That's how the powerful benefit from the system. The moment we withdraw our participation from the system collapses. That is the power we have as a collective. But in order to
until you have a critical mass. If you don't have the critical mass,
and how do you get critical mass?
Well, I'm hoping you're going to tell me.
Critical consciousness. So that's why it's always the first step, is that we need to be talking about having these conversations, which are happening again and again. And this is why Palestine and the Palestinians especially are so incredible for what they're doing. Like, when we talk about Mu'taz and Bizan and these Palestinian journalists who are risking their lives to send this message out there, and we call them heroes, like, they are truly heroes, because the messages and the footage and the way in which they are conveying that message to the rest of the world, like, this is enabling this conscious awakening to happen. This is not just about Palestine, but Palestine is at the center of a movement, I think, that would free the world. And that's why we can't stop at a ceasefire. A ceasefire is the first step. It has to happen. We have to stop the death and the destruction. But when the ceasefire happens, and it'll happen when it gets too expensive, when it gets too inconvenient, when there's too much political pressure. When it happens, we move on and we ask for a free Palestine. And when we've got the free Palestine, we move on and we ask for a free world. And I think when Palestine is free, then the world really has a chance to be free.
So there were, we spoke ahead of the podcast, and there were a few, there's two things I've written down that you mentioned which I thought were interesting, and I think it leads nicely to a question specifically about what's happening now in Gaza. You mentioned Congo, if you remember on that call, and you were talking about the destabilization and the tech. I think it would be good to touch on that a little bit, and then you also spoke about the COVID vaccine, which is a random throwback, I think, for a lot of people. But the question I wanted to ask, and I'm kind of feeding you the answer here, like in terms of how you line it up, is what is the if we assume that underpinning everything is capitalism, which I think you are underpinning everything.
Underpinning everything is capitalism. Yeah,
you're happy with that. Like this is your version of the world, if we can. What's the capitalistic advantage to what's happening today in Gaza? Is there one? And like I said, if you can reference the other stuff, because I think that's also really interesting and important, just to give context as to how these things.
Yeah, I mean, capital. So the growth imperative of capitalism specifically, which is this idea that we need to keep growing capital, I think is essentially the root of these systems, which then enable global oppression. That's not to say, the Holocaust, which is the example I gave earlier, is a good example of how the ideologies that were born as a result of this capital gain, this growth imperative, can sometimes take on a life of their own and go out of control. What's happening in Gaza today does have some capital undertones, right? And two things in particular you can think about. One is natural resources. So there is gas in Gaza, right? And in fact, in most conflict zones in the world, especially where the US is involved, you will find some form of natural resource, right? That they want or they want access to. We know about the export of weapons and what that's doing to the UK and the US economy and how that's benefiting them massively. We know that for Israel, the land grab itself is a big win, right? But so there is a capital incentive to the invasion of Gaza. But more importantly, what I was highlighting is the idea that actually the colonial mindset and the white supremacist mindset that is enabling the genocide in Gaza were born from capital imperatives. Like, that's really important to keep in mind. But yeah, I mean, essentially every global system that perpetuates oppression in the world is born of the growth imperative of capitalism. And what's happening in Congo, our discussion around that was that essentially there's a genocide happening in Congo right now. And it's not being talked about that much. And I haven't been talking about it that much, largely because of what's happening in Palestine. But really, the reading I've done about Congo and my understanding of it has enhanced because of what's happening in Palestine. When I say they're waking up the world, this is part of that waking up the world. In Congo, they are one of the richest countries in the world in terms of natural resources, in terms of they're in the center of Africa and they have incredible mineral wealth, right? But obviously we don't see that prosperity in terms of the country and the way it operates. And the reason we don't see it, I think we grew up with this white supremacist idea that it's because their governance is not good. Black people aren't great at governing themselves. Africans don't know how to, they're savages, And even though we might not consciously have said that, it's always been in the back of our mind. If the British had these natural resources, they would be doing much better. Like that's the kind of mindset which we have. In reality, it's because they were colonized previously. When they weren't colonized, they have been kept in a situation where external forces, imperial forces, the US, the UK, have kept them in a situation where they can never settle. They have always had strife and suffering and fighting in those regions, because by keeping that strife and suffering and destabilizing that region, it keeps the cost of lithium, cobalt low enough for our tech to be affordable to us here in the UK and in the US. there was a great experiment done a while back. Like, I'm going to zoom out from Congo and just explain this from a global perspective. Somebody took a hamburger, a beef burger from McDonald's and said, this McDonald's beef burger, I'm making up the figures now, it's $4 in the US, right? And said, if we break it down and think about the supply chain, and if we paid everyone involved in, the manufacture, like the people who grew the wheat for the bread, the who cultivated the land, whatever, if we paid everyone fairly, and if we were, the same way we would pay US workers or UK workers for this burger, how much would this hamburger be? The meat comes from Brazil. They worked out, it would work out to $35 a hamburger. That's a hamburger. This was done in 2019.
That figure's the actual figure.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Wow.
Yeah. And now apply that to your tech for a minute, right? Like, these systems are so interconnected. This is why when you deal with one, you deal with them all. So like,
iPhones are expensive enough as it is.
iPhones are expensive enough, but where is that money going?
Money? Yeah, of course.
Like, Apple have the biggest cash reserves. They have more cash reserves than most countries have, right? And at the same time, there are people, literally children, working themselves to death to mine cobalt for Apple's iPhones. Like, that disconnect that we have, but we need it. We need to keep that tech cheap so that we can have our iPhones and our Pixels and our Macs as cheaply as possible. And the moment you correct that, what happens? Our tech becomes so expensive that not everyone can afford to have an iPhone, not everyone can afford to have a Mac, and the world system, the economy starts shrinking, right? And yes, it's a necessary sacrifice that we need to make, but this is exactly what the powers that be need to stop from happening. So it's easier to keep people subjugated, to let these systems keep running. I don't know if I've covered what you wanted me to talk about around Congo. COVID.
That was the other one that I thought was interesting.
COVID is a good example because, it was actually it was an organization that got in touch with me around the vaccination of COVID, because my dad was quite ill with COVID. And so they wanted to understand my experience at the hospitals and everything. But the campaign they were running was around the COVID vaccination. Now, I'm not a conspiracy nut when it comes to the COVID vaccination. The COVID vaccination was a great piece of tech and it worked, right? Like, and we can see the results of it now. It worked and it stopped. And, people know more about that than I do. I took it as well. But
thank you for clarifying.
I just wanted to make sure you're not like... But there was a conspiracy when it came to the COVID vaccination. The conspiracy was right in front of our eyes. Like, the COVID vaccination was developed at different universities. The government gave grants to the universities to pay for the staff that worked on the development of the COVID vaccinations. The COVID vaccination, when it was discovered, when it was invented, whatever you say, created, it was then given to be produced to big pharmaceutical companies, and then these big pharmaceutical companies resold it back to the government and essentially made a profit on it twice. And then they said things like, oh, we will hold the price for this long so we don't make any profit on it. They have made billions off the back of it. But this is how capitalism operates. Like, even our governments cannot work in our best interest. They have to work in the corporate interest because they need the economic growth. Right? Like, everything right now is geared towards the growth of capital, and everybody else can go to hell. Every person, homeless person in the UK or the child mining for cobalt in Congo, nothing matters except the growth of capital.
Again, I don't want to get too caught up on this, but do you I'm just intrigued. Do you personally think that if there was no capital incentive, the COVID vaccine wouldn't have been developed as quickly or at all?
It would have been developed, and I think just as quickly. I think what we forget is that we're human beings. Like, think about the people who you admire.
But why couldn't we have developed it without private companies making billions?
We could have.
Why didn't we?
Because the economy needs to grow, because the government needed that economic win, because the growth of capital is this obsession. Like, it's a devilish, shaitani obsession that we've always had.
I think the problem is, and I think there is this concept of trickle-down economics, right? But I don't think many people have seen any of the money that's been made on the COVID vaccine, for example, in our day-to-day lives. Post-COVID, restaurants are more expensive. Our gas and electric bills have gone up. Fuel prices everything is more expensive now.
Yeah.
And no one's getting paid more. So this is one thing I still haven't got my head around, is like where all of this is going. Just I want to come back to one thing you said and just add some of my own input. And you were talking about Palestine being a catalyst, and this particular instance, and like how it led you to read more about Congo. So when I was deciding what to read, I'd finished the book I was reading previously. I was reading a lot of personal development stuff, like very, productivity, mindfulness, all of this stuff. And because of what was happening, I felt like it's not sufficient. It just feels too small-minded to just read something else like that. And that's why I picked up this Noam Chomsky book. I'm now reading the New Age of Empire, which is behind your left shoulder. Yeah. We'll talk about books and stuff in a second. But I personally think it's just the last couple of weeks I've been reading these books has been very, very eye-opening. Because like I said earlier, I've never personally looked at things on like a bigger structural level. We always look very, very small scale. We always look very here and now. And it's just interesting. That's why I said I wanted to have this conversation as a much broader conversation than just kind of zooming in. Yeah. In the interest of time, there's a couple of other things I want to talk about. So I'm going to kind of swiftly, very poorly segue on to the next thing, which was, again, the live that you did a couple of days ago on your Instagram. I'll put the link to your Instagram in the description so people can find you and know that I'm not just making up this live. But you spoke about the Prophet Muhammad. And usually people say that he was a reformer. But you said he wasn't a reformer, he was a revolutionary. You just said he was a revolutionary. You didn't say he was a reformer. I was waiting for you to say the word reformer. And then you spoke about the Mahdi and everything else. So I wanted to kind of, again, this conversation around Palestine, around the systems of oppression, I wanted to kind of re-anchor it and give a bit of your perspective on like an Islamic historical narrative. I feel like I'm just asking you to do loads of like essays in a. I mean,
it's a philosophy. Lot. We're unpacking a lot here. And look, the important thing to recognize about all of this, whether we talk about Islam, we talk about critical consciousness, we talk about Palestine, and we keep saying it as zooming out and looking with a wide lens at these global systems. It's not just that, though, right? Like, you're talking also about how you're having an internal realization around this. I'm having an internal realization about this. These systems are not just out there, they're within all of us as well. And actually the work for liberation that we have to do starts here and then emanates outwards. Like, it's really important to recognize that it's all connected. We're not talking about two different things when we talk about that. Yeah. And that's how Islam was as well, right? The Prophet had this, it came to Mecca and had this really spiritual, not individual, but really spiritual personal message to each of us, right? Like the Quran, the Makki surahs in the Quran are very sort of personal, very spiritual messages. It was when he went to Medina that he had this polity, suddenly this political system which he was looking after. But what I mean when I say the Prophet was revolutionary, and by the way, I don't think it's a contradiction to what people are saying. Like, when people call him a reformer, I think it's just they're using it as a they're using that word, but what they mean is revolutionary. Because actually, what would the difference be? In my eyes, the difference between someone who reforms and someone who revolts is that a reformer works within the system. I think of liberals as reformers. They say, oh, yes, the world is terrible. Now I need to work and join the Labour Party and become an MP and try and have better policies. Whereas someone like me says, yes, the world is terrible. We need to tear down this system. Like, that's a different way of looking at it. And when I talk about revolution, I mean, Salim, let's come up with a better system by which we can have the same outcome that policy would have on a local level, but you and I will do it. We don't rely on the current systems of power that exist. And that's what the Prophet did. The Prophet didn't rely on the systems of power that were there. In fact, he went and he he smashed the statues, right? Like that was his revolution. It was revolt. When the Meccans came to him and said, "We'll give you the sun in one hand and the moon in the other hand," his response was, "No, sorry." What he said, "You could give me the sun in one hand and the moon in the other hand, and I will not." And Abu Talib, Abdul Muttalib, these people stood up for the Prophet against the current system that was there. What the Prophet did was awaken people spiritually and politically, right? Individually and collectively, and created a system that was entirely outside any of the current norms that existed on his own. And he was hugely successful in doing it. But what we have to recognize is when we talk about the Mahdi, and we talk about the Mahdi from a Muslim perspective, but you can apply it from any religious perspective in terms of all Abrahamic faiths have a Messiah or something like that, right? Even non-Abrahamic faiths. Even people who believe in liberation movements but don't have a faith attached to it, they have a belief around revolution or like some sort of tipping point or turning point, right? I think they're all the same thing. And actually, what we have to recognize that the Prophet had this major, incredible impact in his community, but he didn't fix everything in one go. And yet when we talk about the Messiah or the Mahdi, we expect that he or she, in some faith traditions, will come and the entire world will suddenly be just and peaceful. It's not going to work like that. If it could work like that, the Prophet would have done it. The way it's going to work is that will happen when all of us collectively can support that happening. And that's why what Palestine is doing for us is starting that process. This awakening people. The first stage is always going to be waking yourself up to the system, waking those around of you up to the systems, like recognizing why things happen the way they happen, how things happen. When we can operate consciously in the world like that, then we can move to see how we can change it.
That leads very nicely, I think, to the sort of, I don't like, and since day one when we started with the Muslim Vibe, I was very keen on not creating problems and like saying, oh, this is wrong and this is wrong and this, but like, okay, fine, you can highlight problems, but then also come up with solutions, and let's talk about the roadmap out of this. So in terms of specifically on Palestine first, what action can people take? Like I said, I felt more helpless than I ever have. Bear in mind, we set up the Muslim Vibe in 2012 or 2014. So ever since then, whenever I felt like, okay, this issue we need to be talking about, I would be able to put out an article, put out a podcast, an image on social media, and we're talking about it. We're waking people up, whatever. At the beginning of the conflict, I wasn't doing this podcast. I wasn't doing anything with the Muslim Vibe. I felt helpless. I went to the protest. I took my kids to the protest because I wanted them to have an introduction like I did to the cause specifically of Palestine, because I think the protests are very small and insignificant in terms of like what they're able to achieve on a political sense. But I think from an internal perspective, they're huge and can be transformational. So I don't ever belittle or downplay the importance of people attending protests, but I think as a realist, I remember going to the Iraq war protest. 2 million people on the streets did nothing, did not change things an inch, and we've seen how many millions have died as a result of our inability through protest to actually leverage and have any change. So I guess the question is like, what can people do? I also feel like, this is a bit of a monologue, but I also feel like we exist in echo chambers on social media. So, by and large, the people that you're sharing content to are going to be on your side of things. You'll have the odd person here or there.
The Zionist comments on my reels would disagree.
Okay, fine. But I think for most people, on your Instagram
it's
stories,
true. I understand what you mean about echo chambers.
So we have echo chambers, right? We have protests. We have writing to our MPs. There's BDS that people are talking about and doing now. And like, I've seen videos from Kuwait and places like this where like Starbucks is entirely empty. And I think whether Starbucks is directly funding, fueling, helping Israel or not, from this like capitalistic let's look at the West as this massive conglomerate perspective, I think it's a very good thing. And if your attempt is to destabilize the control or the hold that the US, that bloc, let's say, has on the world, then yeah, that's how you kind of go about doing it, right? Like money, it's all about money essentially. It's my long-winded way of asking, what can people do?
Okay, so a lot of good things raised there. So
usually I raise good things.
The first is to say that we have to recognize what the ask is. Yeah. So right now we have to, and we are acting in frenzy to get a ceasefire to happen. Like, that's the priority right now, because we need to stop the death, the destruction, the annihilation of a people, essentially, right? Yeah. Like, and when we're operating in that sort of mode, then we have to operate within the system. So consciously, like I said, recognizing the limitations of the system in which we operate, but we have to operate within the system. So we're writing to our MPs, we're protesting, we're asking, but we're also, in parallel with those actions, we are doing direct action. Direct action includes things like boycott, right? Boycott is really powerful. Boycott is powerful because generally, to disrupt the capitalist system, you disrupt the flow of capital. That's what you do. Because in the same way as the system operates without us seeing exactly how it operates, the same can be true for the opposite. If you think about the capital system when it comes to Gaza, we talked about weapons. One of the big campaigns right now is the Shut Elbit Down, which is a Israeli weapons manufacturer. And there's a lot of campaigning happening in the UK. Like, this stuff is having an impact. We know it's having an impact because companies that work with Elbit are now dropping the work that they're doing because they don't want to be involved. The landlords of Elbit are feeling a huge amount of pressure. The ceasefire will happen when it's in the interest of the system for the ceasefire to happen. We have to keep that in mind. It won't happen. The
system of capitalism or the system?
The system of capitalism, the political powers that be right now. Right? The example is apartheid in South Africa, right? So boycott had a big role to play in ending the apartheid in South Africa. We know that the apartheid in South Africa didn't actually end, right? Like, we know even today that 50% of white South Africans live in, 50% of black South Africans live in poverty, 1% of white South Africans live in poverty. Like, there is a major, like, it never really ended, and that's what we'll come on to next. But the formal system of apartheid needed to be broken down. One of the ways in which that happened is it became too economically unviable for the South African government to uphold the system of apartheid because of the sanctions, boycott, divestments. The same when it comes to the formal British Empire holding on to their colonies. The same when it comes to slavery and the abolishment of slavery, right? When the system finds it too expensive, it's not economically viable anymore, then it ends. So what we need to be doing is make it inconvenient for Israel to continue what they're doing, for America to continue supporting them, for weapon manufacturers to export to them. That's why our actions now, given, we were talking on the way here about how there's a sense of despair, right? Like there's a sense of where do we go? We've done the protesting and we've been out there, but I think the important actions right now are disruptive ones. Strike, boycott, shut Elbit down. Like, we have to disrupt the system. We have to be in a position where we recognize our participation in the system is complicit, because without us, the system collapses. So by going about life as normal, we're just participating in the system again. So it's difficult. And I say the struggle is difficult. But for a ceasefire to happen, that's what we have to do. But then we have to go beyond, right? A ceasefire will happen. It will happen, for any number of reasons, but it will happen. And when it does happen, we can't stop, because out of the, horrible things that are happening in Gaza, there is this incredible light that's shining through as well. And I genuinely believe that they're at the center of something incredible. I'm not saying that what we're experiencing now is going to lead directly to the revolution and change the world. I'm saying as a community, as a human community, we are making great strides in a very short amount of time because of the Palestinians. And so the next stage is going to be freeing Palestine. The next stage is going to be much more about reimagining our world without these global systems of oppression, about creating viable alternatives to these systems of oppression, about talking to each other and connecting on a human level with each other, and raising our critical consciousness, raising our consciousness of these systems, operating as very conscious individuals within these systems to the extent that they no longer can stay upright. That's what we need to work to. I know it sounds difficult to imagine.
So the thing is, we don't have the time to get into the things that are on my mind right now. But just very briefly, I'm thinking about how you mobilize as a people in a global sense. It's very easy, right? We have technology, we have social media. But what I'm seeing, and what I've seen over the last few days, is prominent activist voices online being deplatformed, having their Instagram shut down, having their Twitter shut down. And I'm seeing that actually, like, because the world has been built on this kind of, again, capitalistic house of cards, let's say, we are at the whim of the people who control these platforms. And if for whatever reason, whether it's about a country, whether it's whatever it might be, if we are saying things that do not fall in line or sit right or are not liked by these people, then you're going to struggle to really get this stuff out there.
It is interesting, though, how they still haven't been able to shut it down properly, right? Like, everything we're seeing out there, yes, these big voices and activists who are sharing lots of content are being shut down, right? But we're still seeing the footage out of Gaza from smaller accounts, and because what we are doing.
But I'm talking about, the reason I'm getting this now is that I kind of don't want to get into this. But when you talk about collective consciousness, that requires leaders. So, for example, I believe that, and this is why I said, you don't have a chance to rebuttal. I apologize, but like you look at the civil rights movement. You have Malcolm X, you have Martin Luther King, right? These were individuals who, without social media, without Facebook, without Instagram, were able to mobilize through newspapers, through radio, and whatever else. But they were figureheads. They were crucial and important figureheads and are studied till today by thinkers. Right now, we leadership is important, I think, in this.
I don't.
Yeah. Okay. So next time. The final thing, and I asked you to bring some books with you.
Yeah.
But I think what I've realized. Just the last few years, I've started reading a lot more. And I regret, like, with a heavy, heavy heart, the amount of years I spent not reading. And when I was reading, I used to read a lot of fiction, which is fine, nothing against fiction. But I just feel like there are so many ideas. And there's something I told you as well, on the call before, that one of my university lecturers said this to me, that, the thoughts that you are capable of having are limited to your vocabulary. So there are thoughts that people cannot possibly have because they don't know these words exist. And you think about a baby, for example. Babies can't have complex thoughts about what's happening in the Middle East. They don't know any context, but they also don't have the means of doing that. And essentially, some of us can be like that, right? If we're not reading, if we're not educating ourselves, you can easily find yourself just like sleepwalking through life.
100%.
So, you said you started this journey a long time before 2023. What are some of the books that you think people can get started on Palestine, but also broadly on all of these things?
This is a really important point you make about reading, because I think in the age of social media, we feel like the amount of content we're consuming, we know everything about everything through these short form videos, and actually reading really helps to consolidate that sort of. But yeah, one of the books is the one I recommended to you, which is The New Age of Empire, which I feel like, to me, that was a really eye-opening book. I brought some others along with me as well. So
just make sure you talk into the mic when you're
Angela Davis.
Talking the books.
Angela Davis is one of the leaders of the Black Liberation Movement, still alive, still great. But Freedom is a Constant Struggle is great because it has connections between the Black Liberation Movement and Palestine as well. So that's a really good one to get into just now. I brought Less is More by Jason Hickel, Less is More is all about this growth imperative of capitalism and its relationship to the climate crisis, but in general, its relationship to colonialism as well, and how we battle it. He has a bunch of ideas. It's actually a very accessible, very easy book to read, so definitely one I would recommend. Tangled in Terror is by Suhaima Manzoor Khan, and it's about Islamophobia, but again, zooms right out and connects it to these global systems of oppression. And it's one book which I think everybody in the Muslim community, but especially leaders of mosque centers, imams, should be reading Tangled in Terror. And finally, I think Palestine, A Socialist Introduction by Sumaya Awad, is a really good way of looking at Palestine through the lens of these global systems that we've talked about. I also wrote the biography of Malcolm X.
Yeah, I put that behind me.
Yeah, which I think is a great read, and really easy again to read.
Okay, thank you. I'll put I'll list out the books in the description so people can find them if they want to buy them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I was thinking of making some concluding statements about the conversation, but I feel like we've covered a lot.
Yeah. Well, I would say in conclusion that...
Oh, you go for it. Do you want to end out the podcast? Say thank the viewers, tell them to like and subscribe, do all of that. Go for it. No, just do the conclusion. I'll do that.
Yeah, I mean, the conclusion would be that, I don't want to decenter Palestine, right? Like Palestine and what's happening in Gaza right now is in my heart, and it's in all our hearts, and especially as Muslims. This is everything. But I actually want to almost center Palestine and think of it as the central point in a much wider picture. And that what's coming out of Palestine now has the capacity to transform the world. And if everything we've talked about feels overwhelming and too big picture, and it's not what you want to think about right now, I think what you can take away from today is the simple recognition that there's more to it than just what's happening right now. And that if we don't, after a ceasefire, start addressing the global systems, then we enable the same thing to happen again and again and again. And that's the gift and the sacrifice that the Palestinians are making for us. And so we have to utilize that.
I think that was a good conclusion. So yeah, thank you very much, Hasanain. I know you came from Birmingham to do this as well. I do appreciate that. And I'm glad that I could have you on actually as the first guest, and talk about Palestine specifically, but also with this broader concept, because it's stuff that I've been reading and thinking about quite a lot over the last couple of weeks. I guess that draws to a close this first episode of the Muslim Vibe new season, I guess, because it's been like a year, I think, since the last episode. So thank you again, Hasanain. And I think the hope, inshallah, is that we're going to do 2 episodes a month, so one every 2 weeks. I don't know what I'm telling you. I don't think you're that bothered.
I'm interested.
This is more for the listeners. So yeah, the plan is 2 episodes a month. I want to try and make these pieces of content, these episodes, things that you can listen to at any time. So it's not necessarily, even with this conversation, for example, I told Hasanain beforehand that I don't want it to be specifically about, why a ceasefire is important. Obviously, that's important in the context of what's happening. And of course, we want a ceasefire. But I think talking about issues that we're experiencing here and now, but looking at it from a broad perspective is important. And that's the aim and the hope, I think, for this, iteration of the TMV podcast, is that I want to really focus on trying to have conversations that people can listen to at any time, in 5 years, 10 years, as long as, I guess, the systems of oppression are still in place in the same way, then there'll still be relevant conversations, right? If we have a revolution, we can just scrap the whole thing.
It'll still be relevant, like you learn about history.
You can these will be a nice history lesson. But no, thank you all for listening and for watching. We are on YouTube, we're on Spotify and all the other platforms. If this is the first time you've come across the podcast, then please do subscribe, follow, all of that stuff, and also leave a nice 5-star rating wherever you leave your reviews on whatever platform. If you think it's 4 stars or below, we're not interested in hearing from you. But yeah, thank you guys very much, and inshallah we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode.